One of the fascinating aspects in the study of the weekly Torah portion is the realization that the Torah is not merely a guide for religious living and instruction or a roadmap and manual of spiritual exploration. Rather, as the name Torah denotes, it comes from the word guide, hora'ah, that it's an integrated, holistic roadmap, not just for spiritual living and instruction, but for physical, psychological, emotional wellness as well. The Torah presents us the most integrated system for optimal living. In this week's Torah portion, B'Shalach, we find a fascinating episode that occurs just after the seminal story of this week's Torah portion, the splitting of the sea, the saving of the Jewish people from the last threat of the Egyptians, and the song, the shira that they sang subsequently, that we recite in our prayers every day. It is just after this that the Torah relates that the Jewish people traveled on in their journey toward Mount Sinai. And on the way to receive the Torah, they traveled for 3 days, but they could not find any water. At last, they reach a place, but the Torah relates they come to a place, Mara, and they couldn't drink the water, ki marim heim, because it was bitter. And they complained to Moses, what shall we drink? And they cried out to God, and Hashem says to Moshe, take a branch of a tree and throw it into the water. And as Moses does it, it sweetens the water, and the Jewish people have water to drink. It is there that God also gives some mitzvot, some instruction to the Jewish people, specifically Shabbat. And he promises them that if you will keep the mitzvot and the Torah that I am about to give you, then I promise you all the plagues and all the epidemics and pandemics and illnesses that you have experienced back in the land of Egypt, I will not place upon you, because I, Hashem, am your healer. A fascinating but very perplexing story. How does this story inform us that this takes place just after the splitting of the sea on the way to Mount Sinai? That for 3 days they cannot find water. All of a sudden they find water, but it's bitter, they cannot drink it, and a branch of a tree makes it sweet. And what is the connection between that and keeping the mitzvot that are given at that moment? Why specifically does God decide to give those mitzvot at that place called Mara, the place of bitterness, a place of complaining? And what is its connection to the fact that if we observe those mitzvot, we will be well and not have physical ailments? You know, one of the most fascinating interpretations of the story is that the Jewish people were just bitter. They were angry. They were kvetchi, as they say. And the nature of bitter people is that no matter what situation you put them in, they're always going to find the fault. They're always going to find what's wrong with the situation. Fascinatingly, our sages tell us that the water was not bitter at all. Rather, if you look closely at the words of the Parsha, it says, "V'lo yachlu lishtot," they could not drink, ki marim heim, because they were bitter. It doesn't say the water was bitter. Certainly that is the implication. But it reads, ki marim heim, they were bitter. The people were bitter. And when you're bitter, everything you drink tastes bitter. When you're bitter, everything around you is negative. And so a nation who had experienced such sublime miracles, such salvation, who had just recently sang the song, the shira, how can they descend so quickly into an abyss of despair and to complain? Surely the God that saved them time and time again and provided for them could not provide them some water? Why were they at the edge of despair at that time? The answer, my friends, is 3 days. The Talmud tells us that water is a metaphor for Torah. When you travel for 3 days and you have no Torah, when you have nothing to engage spiritually, you become parched. Your soul becomes parched. You become disillusioned. You become cynical. And when that happens, everything that happens in life around you is seen through the lens of bitterness, of despair, indeed even of anger. And that is why our sages instituted that never again shall 3 days go by that we do not study the Torah together. It is based upon this that we have the universal custom of reading the Torah in synagogue 3 times a week, on Shabbat, Mondays, and Thursdays. So this way, we don't have a 3-day break between studying the Torah. Because when 3 days go by and you don't drink from the spiritual waters of Torah, we begin to become complainers. No matter all the blessings that God gives us in the world, we will find something to complain about. It's not good enough. It's bitter. It's not pristine. It's not filtered. It's not spring water. It's just regular water. But what does God tell Moshe to do? To throw in an eitz. Where do we know the eitz from? Every time we lift the Torah, we say, Eitz chayim hi lamachazikim ba. The Torah is the tree of life. It is no coincidence that today is the 15th of Shvat, Tu B'Shvat, where we celebrate the Rosh Hashanah for tree, because tree is the ultimate metaphor for the human being. Ki ha'adam eitz hasadeh, the man is a tree of the field, and the Torah is an eitz chayim, is a tree of life. We hold on to the tree of life because when we put a little bit of Torah, just a little bit of an eitz, a branch, into the water, all the water becomes sweet. All the bitterness of life dissipates. And that is why God gave the Jewish people the mitzvot, specifically of Shabbat, at that moment. Because Shabbat teaches us to have reliance on the Almighty, that everything we have in life is a blessing, and that God will provide for us. If not for that, the believing Jew could not rest when the rest of the world is moving forward. But we know, we believe that the God that provided for us from Sunday through Friday, will provide for us in Shabbat as well, and we have nothing to worry about. And not only that, not only materially will we be okay, God promises us that if we study the Torah and not let 3 days go by without the study of Torah, not only will our perspective and our mood change, we will look at the world and our lives with a greater appreciation. We won't see bitterness everywhere. We won't see negativity everywhere we look. We can look at something objectively and see that it's sweet and see the blessings that we have, not the blessings that we still don't have or we want. And that is why God promises us, specifically at the place called Mara, bitterness, that if we keep the Torah and the mitzvot, all the illnesses, all the pandemics, it is here that God makes the promise of physical well-being, of emotional well-being. And when we have that, we will have physical and spiritual well-being too. May God bless us on this day of the 15th of Shvat, in the portion of Beshalach, when God showed us that all we have to do is put a little bit of Torah, put a little bit of spirituality, in the metaphor of the tree, the original tree, the tree of knowledge, the tree of Torah, and we dip it into our water. All the waters around us that seemingly were so bitter just a moment ago are now sweet. And when we make sure that 3 days don't go by that we don't engage in some serious Torah learning, in some serious observance of Judaism, God promises us that not only that we will be happy psychologically and emotionally, but physically, all the illnesses that we are afraid of in the world, all the pandemics, God promises us, Ani Hashem Rofecha, I am the Lord your healer. Attach yourself to the tree of life. And then what you will have is not only happiness emotionally, not only happiness psychologically and spiritually, but happiness and wellness on a physical level as well. May God heal us all on this day, in spirit and physically, as we mentioned by the Torah, Refuat HaNefesh u'Refuat HaGuf v'nomar Amen. Shabbat Shalom.